Good morning, everyone. Welcome. I call this hearing of the Committee on Small Business Subcommittee on Economic Growth and Access to Capital to order. I'd like to thank all of our witnesses for being here today. We look forward to your testimony. Let me give just a very brief opening statement. How to help our fellow citizens in their time of need is one of the most important questions we deal with as a society and as it relates to government. In the aftermath of a disaster, when a storm takes everything you have, the true test of resiliency is revealed. After a storm, homeowners and businesses grab a broom, a power washer, a chainsaw, and get to work trying to rebuild their lives. To do this, disaster victims need money to rent a generator and purchase construction supplies. One thing they do not need is endless paperwork delays and confusing directions on how to obtain assistance. Under the current system, both state and federal resources are mobilized to respond to a disaster, where they work hand in hand to conduct search and rescue operations, offer immediate food and shelter needs, and long-term rebuilding assistance. To help rebuild, the government offers both subsidized and unsubsidized financial assistance. This allows our neighbors access to funds when they need it most. Today, we are here to try and answer a couple important questions. Is this assistance appropriate, and if so, how can it be given most effectively? How do we balance the American ideal of self-reliance with the practice of we as taxpayers paying to ensure the extra resources are available for those trying to rebuild? To help us answer these questions, we have a distinguished panel of witnesses here today. These witnesses will inform us about their experience in the aftermath of a disaster and provide their thoughts about the proper role of government. I look forward to this discussion today, and I now yield to the ranking member for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In today's era of modern technology and all the comforts we enjoy, we sometimes think we're beyond Mother Nature's reach, and we get reminded again and again, whether it's Katrina or Irene, that indeed Mother Nature can make a huge difference in each and every one of our lives. This disaster in Hurricane Irene, of course, what started down in North Carolina, came all the way up the coast through New York and into New England, causing unprecedented amounts of damage to people's homes and America's small businesses. The recovery tools that we have at our disposal in SBA for small businesses and homeowners are only effective if our agency utilizes them correctly. In the wake of Irene, the SBA deployed 398 disaster assistance workers to staff 160 recovery centers all up and down the eastern seaboard. As of the beginning of this month, the SBA issued over 183,000 loan applications and already approved 8,000 loans, totaling over $200 million. Most of these loans were processed within the agency's target time frame of 10 days or less, and that was a big improvement over Hurricane Katrina. And while the response, I think, was a step in the right direction, we also have some improvements that need to happen. For the victims of Irene, only 1 out of every 3 applications for assistance was approved. That's lower than the Hurricane Katrina rate of 51%. It's also about half of the agency's historical approval rate, so we'd like to understand that. And despite the fact this disaster happened over 8 months ago, only 60% of the funds that have been allocated have actually been dispersed. So that amounts to about $77 million of actual assistance that's found its way into the pockets of disaster victims so far. So these figures do suggest we need some reforms. We look forward to hearing from the panel about what form those should take. It's that, I think, for those reasons that H.R. 3042, the Disaster Loan Fairness Act, has been introduced. It's hopefully going to address some of the shortcomings that we've identified so far. We'll play off of what we hear today from our witnesses about any other improvements that need to happen. And I think it's just really bottom line important to understand that it is the small businesses that are job creators here for our country right now. The Northeast and Eastern Seaboard are a big part of this great country's job creation machine that we want to get back on track. And a lot of businesses, 40, 60% of them don't recover after a disaster in the small business arena. So we really need to make sure these programs work. Between Katrina and Irene, unfortunately, we've gotten some great lessons to hopefully learn from. We don't want to learn again in a bad way, and looking forward to having this hearing help us understand things a little bit better. And with that, I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Schrader. I understand that there's a request from Mr. Barletta from Pennsylvania, a member of the Small Business Committee, to join us for today's subcommittee hearing. If that's okay with the ranking member, welcome, Mr. Barletta. Let me just quickly go over the rules for our witnesses. If any of the other committee members have an opening statement prepared, I ask that it be submitted for the record. You'll each have about 5 minutes to deliver your testimony. The light will start out as green. When you have 1 minute remaining, the light will turn yellow, and finally it will turn red at the end of your 5 minutes. Do your best to keep it within that 5 minutes. Let me introduce our first witness today, Doug Hole, Director of the North Carolina Division of Emergency Management. In this position, Doug is responsible for disaster response for the state of North Carolina. Doug began his career in emergency management in 1976 and worked for the Raleigh-Wake County Emergency Preparedness, the North Carolina Division of Emergency Management, and FEMA. Doug became Assistant Director of the North Carolina Division of Emergency Management in 1998 and Director in 2005. Mr. Hole is testifying on behalf of the National Emergency Managers Association. Welcome. I look forward to your testimony.
Thank you, Chairman Walsh. Good morning to all of you, and thank you, Ranking Member Schrader, for the opportunity to talk, and to all the distinguished members of the committee, of the subcommittee. My name is Doug Hoyle. I am Director of the North Carolina Division of Emergency Management. And again, thank you for the opportunity to present testimony today on behalf of the National Emergency Management Association. NEMA represents the state emergency management directors of all 50 states, the District of Columbia, and the U.S. territories. I've included my full statement for the record, so I'll give you a quick overview now and look forward to answering your questions. While not a traditional first responder agency, the Small Business Administration is a critical partner to states and localities affected by a wide variety of disasters. Following a disaster, Small Business Administration has the capability to mobilize staff from the Office of Disaster Assistance to begin disseminating public information about what services the SBA can provide to supplement many long-term federal recovery programs. While a major disaster declaration is awarded by the President, affected citizens begin the registration and eligibility determination process through FEMA. The entry point to FEMA assistance is through FEMA's Individual Assistance Program. The first step in that process is to have the applicant complete an application for a Small Business Administration loan. An applicant may have insurance, but it may not be enough to return them to their pre-disaster standard of living. Often, citizens encounter damages and devastation from disasters which are ineligible under FEMA disaster recovery programs. SBA loans can help return a damaged home to its pre-disaster condition, including implementation of mitigation measures. Following Hurricane Irene last year in North Carolina, SBA loaned more than $43 million to eligible North Carolina citizens. Due to the importance of small business in a local community, SBA's Economic Injury Disaster Loan is a program that supports the whole-of-community approach to disaster recovery. The Economic Injury Disaster Loan affords business owners continuity of operations by loaning to eligible businesses the funds to meet their ongoing obligations and to pay ordinary and necessary operating expenses. SBA was a critical resource in the state of North Carolina when a landslide on U.S. Highway 129 impeded traffic and prevented the day-to-day operations of business owners between North Carolina and Tennessee. The Economic Injury Disaster Loan Declaration made it possible for the businesses in both states to continue critical trade and accessibility functions. Programs designed to help disaster survivors are useless unless citizens understand the options available to them. SBA does a considerable amount of work in communities around the country, making personal contacts with chambers of commerce, with congressional offices, with state and local elected officials, with business organizations, and with community groups. SBA and state agency public information officers develop press releases announcing availability of disaster loans in affected areas. Media outlets are also informed of the declaration, and they are enlisted to alert the affected citizens to every opportunity to seek and receive assistance for their disaster recovery. In testimony given by the General Accounting Office before this committee back in November of 2011, William Scheer referenced steps SBA continues to take to improve their marketing and outreach efforts. We look forward to continuing dialogue with SBA and are encouraged by their increased attention to the needs of individuals and communities. As a profession, emergency management stakeholders have focused a great deal on partnerships, which help us achieve a resilient and sustainable nation. FEMA Administrator Craig Fugate has stressed the importance of the whole of community and FEMA's position as a member of a much larger team to support the response and recovery to all hazards. There's no doubt that the SBA Office of Disaster Assistance is a vital member of the emergency management team, and we value their contributions to our communities. The continued challenge of protecting the nation from a variety of hazards within the reality of fiscal uncertainty elevates the importance of cooperation throughout the emergency management community and makes leveraging resources from across the federal family even more critical. Positive relationships between federal, state, and local government stakeholders are the linchpin to coordinated recovery efforts supporting resilient individuals, prosperous businesses, and thriving economies. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today and your continued attention to disaster assistance matters under your purview. Your attention and leadership in this matter are greatly appreciated, and NEMA remains a ready resource for the committee as you tackle tough issues of recovery from disasters.
Perfect timing, Mr. Harrell. Thank you for your testimony.
You're welcome.
I would now like to yield to Mr. Barletta from Pennsylvania to introduce our next witness.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for allowing me to participate today. I am pleased to welcome Mr. Gene Teig, constituent and small business owner from Pittston, Pennsylvania. Mr. Teig manages sales for his family business, GT Fabrication Incorporated, a precision metal fabricating business serving clients around the United States. His family has run the company for over 2 decades, and I am proud to say they have a reputation for reliability, precision, quality, and competitiveness throughout the entire industry. Despite strong competition from abroad, this American-owned and operated business continues to serve our citizens despite the tough economic climate and the devastating flooding that ravaged Pennsylvania and the Northeast. I am glad Mr. Teig accepted the committee's invitation to hear what his family and company went through in order to reopen after the flooding. His testimony will contribute to the debate over the role of the federal government in providing disaster relief to our nation's citizens when they are most vulnerable. Thank you, Mr. Teig.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Schrader, thank you for inviting me here today to tell my story about the flood caused by Tropical Storm Lee. My name is Gino Teig. I manage sales for a family business, GT Fabrication Incorporated, a precision metal fabricating and powder coating business. My parents, Gene and Debbie Teig, started the company more than 20 years ago. My sister Tracy and I have joined the family operation. Our company has had its ups and downs. We supplied large clients like Pride Mobility. However, like so many other manufacturers, we lost many of our main customers to overseas competitors. We have not given up. We've adapted. We widened our customer base to produce more products in new industries. Our family business has survived many hurdles, but most recently, natural disaster threatened to close our doors. My story begins on September 7th, 2011 at 2 in the afternoon. Projections showed the Susquehanna River would rise to 35 feet by 3 p.m. the next day. Just 2 hours later, predictions changed, bumping it up to 38 feet by 3 o'clock. My family and our employees immediately knew our company would face heavy damages because our building is located 100 yards away from the Susquehanna River in Pittston, Pennsylvania. We have been flooded before. We knew that this this time we couldn't move some of our equipment. We had 6 machines in the excess of 25,000 pounds. So we started moving smaller equipment, materials, computers, and files. We worked through the night to move materials up to our back building. When our back building was built 4 feet higher because of past floods, we stored materials on pallet racking to try to keep them out of harm's way. After working through the night, by September 8th at 8 a.m., the water crept into our parking lot. By 9 a.m., we had a foot of water in our downstairs building. We did all we possibly could do and exited the facility. Water levels were rising at a breakneck speed. In 4 previous floods, the river has never risen so quickly. Millions of dollars of equipment left in the building, and we knew we were in trouble. Despite paying $15,000 for flood insurance every year, we knew we could only expect to collect the maximum of $500,000 in contents and $500,000 in building damages. By the time the Susquehanna River crested at 1 a.m., September 9th, all I could see of GT Fabrication was the very top of our building. My family and I were devastated. Our 30 employees were devastated. We didn't know if our family business could survive this, and that is a horrible feeling. The watermark on GT Fabrication's lower building was recorded at 15 feet. On our back building, which was raised 4 feet to serve as a precaution against flooding, the watermark was recorded at 9 feet. On September 10th, almost 2 days after flooding began, the water finally receded to 12 inches. I was the first one to enter the building to see the damage. As soon as I got into the building, my heart sank. The destruction that the flood caused was by far the worst it's ever been. I really couldn't believe what I was seeing. Simply put, it looked like a bomb went off. My family, friends, and several of our employees were waiting outside for me to tell them the news. All I could say to them was, "It's bad, but we'll bounce back." But they had no idea. I pulled my father aside to warn him that we had a lot of work ahead of us if we wanted to stay in business. I could see defeat in his eyes. The successful business he had built from the ground up was wiped out, just like that. The next day, we did the only thing we knew to do. We got to work. We ordered 3 40-yard trash hoppers, a 3-phase generator, power washers, brooms. We spent tens of thousands of dollars to start the cleanup process. We had to dry, gut, clean both buildings, but almost everything was destroyed. At the exact same time, we also had to do damage control with our customers. We had to outsource all of our work to finish our pending orders. We set our customers up with our other vendors, our competitors, until GT Fabrication came back on its feet. Additionally, I knew that we desperately needed financial help because we weren't doing any business and we were draining the company's funds on cleanup effort. I spoke to a Small Business Administration disaster representative who told me to quickly complete the application for disaster loan. As soon as I could fill out the documents, I brought the paperwork to the SBA disaster response site. The SBA staff looked it over and told me I was missing a few documents. I immediately brought the missing documents back down to the disaster site. The SBA official even complimented me on my thorough completion of the application. We had to throw almost $1 million worth of supplies and demolish the inside lobby and office. After almost 3 weeks of backbreaking cleaning, an SBA inspector visited GT Fabrication to assess the damages and take pictures. A few days after the inspector's visit, we received an SBA disaster assistance packet, which stated they wanted us to provide monthly sales figures for the past 3 years. Additionally, SBA noted that they again needed tax form 8821. More than a month after filling our original application out, we received an SBA loan request to complete tax form 8821 for the 3rd time. This time, we included a letter stating we had completed this document twice previously. When you're in disaster mode, working 15 hours a day, 7 days a week to save your family business, you don't have time to fill out all this paperwork, especially after many of our records were destroyed by 15 feet of water during the flood. Regardless, we provided the SBA with information that they needed as quickly as possible. It actually seemed as though the SBA was trying to purposefully discourage us from applying for an SBA loan. We had to find something else in the meantime. GT Fabrication was fully not back to business, and we had not yet received an SBA loan. The company bank account was running dry. Then Pennsylvania State Senator Yudichak called us to tell us about the Luzerne County Flood Recovery Loan Program. This is a $4 million low-interest loan program that had a borrowing limit of $100,000. Program applies at 1% interest rate with no borrower's fee. This quick, easy loan saved GT Fabrication by providing us an infusion of cash that we so desperately needed. Today, GT Fabrication is back in business, though we are only operating at 70%. I have been able to get almost two-thirds of my employees back to work. We look forward to getting back to 100% and growing our business so we can do our part in turning around our local, state, and national economy. It is my belief that this small businesses like ours that will add jobs to the U.S. economy. But I am disappointed that the Federal Government has not provided more effective assistance to small businesses at this time of greatest need. Our experiences was marked by bureaucratic red tape and ineffective disaster loan program. The City of Pittston has been very helpful retaining consultants to help us relocate to a larger facility and a safe distance from the river. And Luzerne County provided us the loan that saved our business. But sadly, the Federal Government, in my view, failed. I hope that my story could shed some light on the problems that other small businesses face. I want to thank the members of this committee, particularly Congressman Barletta, for working to improve the effectiveness of the SBA loan programs. Thank you again for the opportunity to be here today, and I will be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Teigen. Thank you for that powerful, powerful testimony. I'd now like to recognize Ranking Member Schrader, who's going to introduce our next witness.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Howard Kunruther, James G. Dinan, Professor of Decision Sciences and Public Policy at Wharton School, University of Pennsylvania. In addition to his research, writing, and teaching, he's also been co-director of the Wharton Risk Management Decision Process Center, where he works on improving the roles of public and private sectors in reducing losses from natural disasters and aiding the recovery process following a catastrophic disaster. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, Representative Schrader and Chairman Walsh and other members of the committee. Excuse me. I really appreciate the invitation to testify here on this particular bill. And I do want to make a point right at the outset that I'm very, very sympathetic to what Mr. Teig has said with respect to his challenges and problems that he faced. But I want to raise really 3 points in my testimony. The first is, why is the proposed legislation to extend SBA disaster loans at 1% to cover both disaster losses and other outstanding debts likely to increase future losses from natural disasters? Second, can we utilize other mechanisms like insurance coupled with policy tools to reduce future losses so that the SBA can play a secondary role in providing funds for disaster recovery? And there's no question SBA may have a role to play. How can the National Flood Insurance Program, which is now up for renewal and for discussion, be modified so as to set a tone as to ways that the public and private sectors can work together to reduce losses from floods and other disasters like storm surge from hurricanes? So those are the 3 points I'd like to emphasize. Let me talk about the first point and raise 2 issues, and I know that Dr. Mulhausen may be saying more about one of them, and so he'll probably elaborate on that. With respect to the SBA, the provision of 1% loan, it creates a moral hazard problem in the following sense. It encourages people to locate their home and businesses in hazard-prone areas while at the same time reducing the economic incentive to purchase insurance and invest in mitigation measures prior to a disaster. So we have to be aware of the fact that if you're going to get very low-interest loans, people may say, I don't need to necessarily be protected. The proposed program also has a potential of creating a situation where people actually may be better off after the disaster than before financially, and I recognize all the other problems that one faces. But if you get a 1% loan for retiring your old debts as well as your disaster losses, and I have an example in my testimony to highlight that, the actual payments would be lower than they were before the disaster if you had previous SBA loans. So I think that has to at least be considered. Let me move to the second point on the role of insurance and other policy tools to reduce future losses. Insurance has 3 basic purposes that it can actually aid in this process. One is it provides a signal of risk to individuals and firms in their current location. If you have premiums that reflect risk, then you will actually be able to know whether or not you have a very severe hazard. Second, it will encourage property owners to invest in loss-reducing measures. If you can get a premium discount, because you should if you invest in something that reduces your losses, then actually you may be in a position where you'll be encouraged to do so. And the third point is insurance supports economic resiliency. Insured individuals and firms can make a claim to obtain funds to help pay for the loss caused by the catastrophe. And I recognize that the flood insurance program may have to extend limits, which are one of the questions that I know would have to be raised. Let me give two guiding principles that has really reflected all of our work in this area with respect to insurance. Principle number one is that insurance premiums have to reflect risk for the reason that I've stated. So people have a signal of how hazardous it is, and they can invest in mitigation measures. Principle number two is just as important, and it's called equity and affordability. And when you have premiums that reflect risk, there may be people who need special treatment. They should not be given it by an insurance premium. They should be given by an insurance voucher, like a food voucher or a stamp. And the reason for that is that it enables one to still see what the premium is on the basis of the risk, and at the same time, they will have an opportunity to get a premium discount if they invest in mitigation measures. What we have been working with in Congress and would like to put forward is a few ideas for the National Flood Insurance Program reform that would actually try to move in that direction. The first is multi-year insurance, not tied to the individual, to the property, because people cancel their policies if they turn out that they have not imposed a claim. If they have not received a claim, they'll tend to cancel their policies. It's hard to convince people that the best return on an insurance policy is no return at all, that you should celebrate not having a loss. The second point is we would want insurance vouchers for those needing special treatment. Third, you may want to consider required insurance for property owners because there's so few people many people do not have their policies. And a fourth point is multi-year loans for mitigation. And if the mitigation measure to reduce the losses is a cost-effective one, the actual cost of the loan may be actually less than the premium reduction one receives, so it will be financially attractive for people to invest in mitigation. And finally, well-enforced building codes. Having said all of that, there certainly will be a role that the SBA will have to play after a disaster, but the emphasis should be to place more attention on reducing these losses beforehand. To conclude, our country has entered a new era of catastrophes. Our exposure is growing, and the damage from disasters over the next few years is likely to be more devastating than what we have experienced during this past decade. When the next catastrophe occurs, the federal government will very likely come to the rescue again. If the public's response to recent disasters is an indicator of their future behavior, new spending records will be set with respect to federal assistance unless steps are taken to reduce future losses, and they should be undertaken now. And so, with all due respect to all of the challenges after a disaster, I'd like to at least argue that we better try to do more to prevent these losses from occurring. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Doctor. Our final witness that I have the pleasure of introducing is Dr. David Muhlhausen, Research Fellow in Empirical Policy Analysis at the Heritage Foundation here in town. Dr. Muhlhausen joined Heritage in 1999 after serving on the staff for the Senate Judiciary Committee. He holds a doctorate in public policy from the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, and a bachelor's degree in political science and justice studies from Frostburg State University. Dr. Muhlhausen is also an adjunct professor at George Mason University. Welcome, sir. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you. My name is David Muhlhausen. I'm a research fellow in empirical policy analysis in the Center for Data Analysis at the Heritage Foundation. I thank Chairman Joe Walsh, Ranking Member Kirk Schrader, and the rest of the committee for the opportunity to testify today on the Disaster Loan Fairness Act. The views I express in this testimony are my own and should not be construed as representing any official position of the Heritage Foundation. After the President declares a major disaster, the Disaster Loan Fairness Act would set the interest rates for the Small Business Administration's disaster loan program at 1% for eligible applicants. Unfortunately, as my testimony will illustrate, the Disaster Loan Fairness Act does not provide the necessary reform to our nation's disaster prevention and recovery programs. My testimony focused on three deficiencies of the legislation. First, by providing more generous benefits, the legislation does nothing to reduce the over-reliance of state and local governments on the federal government for the provision of recovery assistance. Far too frequently, the federal government has been the primary source of recovery efforts for natural disasters that are inherently localized in small geographic areas and do not rise to the level that should require action by the federal government. Increasingly, Americans are becoming overly dependent on federal assistance after natural disasters occur. Further, disaster assistance appears to have become a political tool because the number of disaster declarations is significantly higher in election years compared to non-election years. Since 1996, the year President Clinton sought re-election, the number of disaster declarations issued by FEMA dramatically increased. The chart in my written testimony demonstrates this trend. The previous record of the most declarations in a year was set by President Clinton in 1996 with 158 incidences. President Obama smashed this record with 242 declarations in 2011. Given that 2012 is a presidential election year, I doubt this record is going to last very long. Essentially, this trend is the result of disaster responses that were once entirely local in nature and handled by state and local governments becoming nationalized, and thus the responsibility of the federal government. Second, with out-of-control spending surging and public debt threatening our nation's stability, the Disaster Loan Fairness Act increases federal spending. Instead of practicing fiscal constraint, the legislation does not reduce the cost of future disaster recoveries. Reform should be focused on preventative measures that limit the cost of disasters. Contrarily, this legislation puts the federal taxpayer on the hook for more spending. Third, increasing the generosity of SBA disaster loans creates a moral hazard by providing greater encouragement for homeowners, renters, and businesses to avoid purchasing adequate disaster insurance because natural disasters are low probability events. Clearly, having adequate insurance before disasters occur is the responsible course of action. While SBA disaster loans are intended to help applicants return their property to the same condition as before the disaster, the unintended consequence of this requirement is that applicants are forced to rebuild in the same disaster-prone location. For example, instead of relocating out of a town sitting in a major flood zone, applicants are required to rebuild in the same exact location. Thus, applicants are still located in a high-risk area, preventing a long-term solution from taking place. While this dilemma exists with or without the passage of the Disaster Loan Fairness Act, the legislation only increases the incentive to rebuild in high-risk areas. In conclusion, the Disaster Loan Fairness Act is neither fair to the federal taxpayer nor an effective reform of our nation's disaster prevention and recovery policies. Instead of considering this legislation, Congress should focus on reforms that make America more resilient to disasters and reduce recovery costs imposed on the federal taxpayer. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mulhausen, for your testimony. Let me begin with just a couple questions. Mr. Hoyle, Dr. Mulhausen alluded to, and as did Dr. Kornreuther alluded to, the fact that federal government is seemingly taking more of the responsibility for disaster assistance away from the states. How would you respond to that? Good thing, bad thing?
Well,
and do you see the same sort of trend?
I would say to you that there are criteria that we have to meet for a presidential disaster declaration under the Stafford Act. And so when we have disasters that affect the state of North Carolina, we look to those criteria. It's a certain per capita cost, to the individuals in the state of North Carolina. Our threshold for public assistance, for example, is over $10 million. And, that's statewide, and then you have to meet the criteria on a county-by-county basis for a county to be declared. So that is on the public assistance side. On the individual assistance side, more where the SBA would come to bear would be, you've got to have numbers of people affected, businesses and people. And so, again, I think that there are criteria that we have to meet. I favor the mitigation efforts. I think mitigation is a good thing, but I would tell you that the mitigation program, the way it's established, is a very slow process, and it takes us 2 or 3 years probably to buy properties or elevate properties and things of that nature.
Has that criteria changed?
The hazard mitigation criteria? or the criteria for federal declaration? Yes, it has. In fact, the figures keep going up, and they just changed this year. In fact, it went up a little bit higher. I don't know the exact numbers. I'm certain we can get them for you if you'd like.
Would you concur with Dr. Muhlhausen that the trend is toward much greater federal assistance?
I think that's absolutely the case, and I think that exactly what Mr. Hole indicated is an important direction one has to go, and that is we really do have to encourage mitigation, and we are very much in favor of excuse me, using the flood insurance program as a starting point for saying if you can reform it in such a way, we can make mitigation a lot more attractive than it currently is. And that's why the whole idea of long-term contracts, long-term multi-year insurance tied to the property, along with a multi-year loan, could actually change that situation radically and in a way that people will then appreciate the fact that when they have a loan, they do not have to necessarily pay the upfront cost, which is what discourages everyone from investing in mitigation. Rather, they will know that they have a longer-term payment and they will get something back in the context of an insurance premium. So it's in that direction that we would want to go, and then the SBA program would have a perspective that I think it doesn't have today. It is being used because people have not taken this action, and everyone is then demanding assistance after the fact.
Dr. Muhlhausen, expand briefly on this notion of overly dependent on disaster relief. Why is that? How does that play out?
Well, I think there's a political benefit. I think after each natural disaster occurs, I think politicians, unfortunately, are upping the ante, wanting to provide more disaster assistance to outdo what was done previously. And so I think Americans have become to expect the federal government to act. And I think Mr. Teague's case is a case study that should be considered where state and local governments provide assistance to his business, not the federal government. And it sounds like his business is doing well and existing and is continuing and was relocated out of a floodplain. And if he did get a SBA disaster loan, would he have been allowed to relocate his business, or would he be still sitting in the same area that was so prone to flooding? So I think that disaster assistance first must be local in nature, based on state and local governments, and then only rise to the level of federal assistance when it overwhelms the capacity of state and local governments to handle the situation. And so I think there's definitely been a normative change in when the Stafford Act has been declared by FEMA.
And last question, Mr. Teague, let's bring this to you. It's a fascinating policy discussion.
Yes.
But you can bring this home like nobody else in this room. Expand on what Dr. Muhlhausen said. I mean, is there, in your testimony, you clearly expressed greater pleasure with the way that local and state reacted to you as opposed to federal. I mean, but as you now look back, is there anything differently you would have or could have done?
At the time, I mean, if anybody has ever been through a disaster, we've actually been through 4 of them. By far, this one was the worst. When you are in a disaster mode, you really aren't thinking about filling out paperwork and doing this and doing that. But also, in the same breath, you have to be very conscious of how much money you're pulling out of your bank account before you go below the zero line. At the time, I went to the local Chamber of Commerce. I spoke to an SBA disaster official. He told me to fill it out and get it in. I was a little leery about the 6% loan, but, I said, would it be good for me to just get in the system? He said, absolutely, get in the system, and then, if something happens down the road, we'll look at it. My biggest problem with them was just the communication back and forth. They've had me fill out same documents 4 or 5 times. And then, at the end of the day, we were draining our bank account. I had to go to somewhere else. The Luzerne County Flood Recovery Program, I mean, it wasn't enough money by far. It was very little, but it did give us a quick infusion of cash. and we were able to get back in business. And like I said, we're not back in business by any means. 70%, mostly powder coating and some manufacturing. But I have $1 million worth of machines in that building. And you know, I have been trying to get relocated for years. And, you know, I just keep getting stonewalled. I mean, obviously, I would like not to be flooded ever again. You know, we have a 35,000 square foot building with machines that weigh 25,000 pounds. You would have to give me 2 weeks to move that equipment. I need cranes to come in. I need riggers to come in. When I find out the day before that the river's going to flood, there's nothing I can do. My hands are tied. So, I mean, you know, going forward, I think, you know, the state did help us out, but you know, if I was able to get the SBA loan for a disaster, I mean, we're an established company. We've been in business for over 20 years.
If you would have gone to your local bank, do you know what your interest rate would have been?
I don't know exactly, but I think it would have been around the same.
Okay. Great. Thank you. Mr. Schrader.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Sorry about what happened to you. That's a business person's worst nightmare.
Thank you.
And not being able to get out of that. Mr. Howell, given some of the comments from Mr. Teague on this, you know, communication issue with SBA and having to fill the same forms out several times, could you comment on why that would even happen?
You know, it's hard to say. Small Business Administration has been a good partner with us, and they have serviced a lot of people in the state of North Carolina. In fact, after Hurricane Irene, over 19,000 people made application to the Small Business Administration and received $43 million in loans. So I can't tell you that we have had a lot of difficulty with the paperwork process.
If you were to have difficulty, is there a mechanism? You know, it's probably personality driven, the real world. And do you have a mechanism? Does SBA, to your knowledge, have a mechanism to deal with that sort of thing, so that if a person in the middle of a disaster says, "Man, I'm filling this form out again," they can call somebody, they can get somebody up the food chain, if you will, to.
When we have a disaster, there are community outreach people that work for the Federal Emergency Management Agency, and SBA has people that also are out there in the community outreach to deal with people who are having difficulty. You know, but the challenge is, like Mr. Ty says, he's busy trying to recover his business, and he may not have the time to engage with them, you know, in more conversation or more, you know, paperwork that they have to deal with. But there are people who are trying to address the needs of the disaster victims out there.
Yeah, not well enough. Mr. Ty, you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I actually talked to SBA field representatives. I've talked to SBA staff members. As a matter of fact, I went out of my way to talk to them and ask them why I was filling this 8821 tax form out so many times, and they couldn't answer the question. And, you know, same thing with, I got a letter from them from Texas, and, you know, it was postmarked for Monday. It was due back in their office on Sunday. The mail doesn't run on Sunday. It's 7 days. I got to get it. I asked the lady, you know, can you explain to me how I'm supposed to do this?
And
she
why
says,
is 7 days such a religious?
Yeah, exactly. And she said, I'm sorry, that's just the way it is.
All right.
So we kind of get straight answers. You know, they don't really want to get into it. And usually when you ask somebody else, they say, well, I don't know.
Yeah,
so
that's the next guy.
Yeah, ask the next guy.
Let's talk about the moral hazard issue. That is something I am concerned about, and I think that, you know, what is the even proper role between SBA and flood insurance? I mean, SBA would be a super disaster assistance when things go beyond the norm, and obviously our flood insurance programs aren't doing what they should be doing, and we don't want to, you know, give a very low. We all on this panel are worried about our debt and deficit at the federal level, and so we were very conscious about the cost of this particular piece of legislation potentially. So what is the balance, if you will? I'd be curious, both Dr. Kunruther and Dr. Mulhausen, on, you know, what's the what's the role of the SBA versus flood insurance? What specific mitigation changes do we need to make in either program, in your opinion, to be more effective? And what's the magic interest rate that you know, gets that right point to avoid moral hazard?
Well, first, I do want to say, before I respond to that, how the sympathetic aspect that we all have for your particular position. And I think a lot of the work that we are doing is very much in the spirit of the question that you're raising. To the extent that one can take steps beforehand, even in the sense of having enough insurance so that you would be protected against the particular losses that one has, that's a very, very important element. And the SBA may have to come in at the end of the day to really provide disaster relief for those who need special treatment. And the question of the interest rate is an important one for people who can get credit and who may have enough income. You may want to have a different interest rate, which is the current policy, from ones who actually are in special need. I think, Representative Schrader, the question you're asking is absolutely the central one from the vantage point of what we I feel, as a whole, a number of us feel has to be done. Where do you find mitigation coming into play? Where do you find insurance coming into play beforehand to avoid a number of the problems that we are hearing from Mr. Teig and from others who have suffered these losses? And our feeling basically is that if you can somehow make mitigation attractive enough, if you can do things that actually let people understand, let businesses understand and residents understand that there are very, very good reasons for doing this, and the moral hazard problem is that they are really not going to get the kind of federal relief that would otherwise be forthcoming, that Dr. Mulhausen mentioned in his testimony and that we have lots of data to suggest. In a presidential election, you know that more so than in other times, you're going to have an enormous amount of support, and we all have sympathy after a disaster. All of us are concerned about exactly that situation. So our feeling is that if you can take the steps beforehand, if you can recognize that insurance has a vital role to play in terms of letting people not only know about what the risk is, but at the same time rewarding people for taking action if they actually do something to reduce that loss, then I think we can move in a direction to actually stem these losses from natural catastrophes. The other point I would want to make on that, and it is really one that I think we all have to recognize, is the affordability issue is critically important here. And so the notion of having a voucher, like a food stamp voucher, that gets designated for insurance, if it turns out people are in special need or need special treatment, we feel is central to making this work for political reasons and for equity and efficiency reasons as well. And let me give you just two examples on that. The first is that if all of a sudden you have a better flood map or you find the levee is decommissioned, there's a resistance by everyone to necessarily have that happen because the congressman, because they feel their constituents will have to pay more as a result of that. We would say, let everyone know that the insurance, what the insurance premium is that reflects the risk, but give a voucher to recognize the fact that now you are having a change with respect to what may have happened. That voucher could be decreased over time, but at least you'll get better flood maps and you'll have a better notion of what the risk is. And the same thing would happen with low-income people, that if there are low-income people and all of a sudden we raise the flood insurance premium to reflect the risk, you need to have a voucher to deal with that. Now, the last point I'll make on the mitigation side, if you do that, if you have a voucher and a person still actually invests in a mitigation measure, they still should get a premium discount. They should not feel just because they have a voucher. They have reduced the losses, and there's no reason why they shouldn't be rewarded for doing that. The voucher was given for other purposes. It was given for equity and affordability. If at that point a homeowner or a business says we still want to mitigate, there is every reason to want to reward them with a premium discount, and with a long-term loan, you will actually encourage it. So it's on those directions that we believe you can address the moral hazard problem in a way that will be effective from the point of view of businesses like Mr. Teig's and homeowners who are living in these hazard-prone areas.
I think Professor Cooner's policy ideas are very encouraging, and I think they need to be looked into at a much greater depth. And I right now cannot sign off on them, but I'm very enthusiastic about exploring his ideas more and working with him in the future. What I do think, though, is that premiums should reflect risk. And this means that there should be regulatory reform on the federal and state level. And that's one of the first steps to get us to a solution. For affordability, I think some of these affordability programs, such as these vouchers, would be best worked at the local level, since most disasters are inherently occurring in small geographic areas that are localized, that can be best dealt with in the first place by state and local governments. And I think they best know their needs, and maybe states can set up their own voucher programs. And whether or not that there would be another layer with the federal government providing such assistance is something that may be explored. But I think on a fundamental level, I think these solutions need to come from the ground up before they come from the top down from the federal government.
Thank you. Quickly?
I'm very sympathetic to what Dr. Mulhausen said, except with the flood insurance program, since it is a national program, you may want to have vouchers coming from FEMA or some government organization, since everything is centralized with the federal government. So that would be the one exception.
Thank you. Let me turn to Mr. Barletta.
Thank you very much. Let me just go back for a few moments and tell you what I experienced during this latest flood. Hurricane Irene and Tropical Storm Lee, which was really a double-barrel disaster to our area. As I traveled throughout my district, I went from community to community, walked the streets, and it was the same scene everywhere I went. Mr. Teig's story here is very familiar, but it was even further than that, actually. I watched as I stood on porches and watched grown men cry. Literally cry. I've had senior citizens tell me that they're not going back into their homes again. I've had businesses telling me, we're going to collect the insurance and we're done. We're not going back into business again. We're not going to go through this again. We can't do this anymore. See, in my part of the state in Pennsylvania, northeastern Pennsylvania, we have the highest unemployment rate in the state. And it sounds good here in Washington, in this beautiful building, to say, well, Mr. Teig, just move, go somewhere else. And when he does, what happens to the people that work there in our area that already is experiencing a high unemployment? What happens to their jobs? What is the cost to the economy if he takes your advice and he goes somewhere far away so this doesn't happen again? Does that help or does that hurt? I have a couple questions. If you can look at those photos over there, that's much what I saw throughout my entire district. Now, I certainly don't believe that these people would move into an area like this so that they could take advantage of some government loan program that we're going to be offering. But I want to ask, the question is, Dr. Mulhausen, do you believe that helping those folks would be politically motivating?
Well, I think upping the ante, making sure that federal assistance becomes more generous year after year is politically motivated.
No, I'm asking these folks right here, these are real people. These are real people. So do you think us coming in to help them is politically motivated? That I would say, you know, maybe these people would vote for me if I came and gave them help. Do you think that enters in anybody's mind when you're witnessing people carrying their life's possessions to the sidewalk to be hauled away? Their memories, their pictures, memorabilia, things that have been given to them from generation to generation. Do you actually believe that when you walk those streets that those folks, that politically motivation would be the reason for trying to help them?
No, I think that there's people who come out of the woodwork, come and help their neighbors, and I think that's good. I think local politicians, local programs can provide assistance, but I think the fact that we see that there is an uptick, a statistically significant increase in presidential disaster declarations during an election year, we know that some of this assistance is politically motivated. It's empirical. It's empirically demonstrated.
I'm not talking about. This wasn't an election year. What about these folks?
Well, I'm sure that we can always help them out, and that's good.
Yeah, here's how we'll help them out. Let me tell you how we'll help them out. If you have a business and you can get credit somewhere else, this is what the United States will do, and this is what SBA will do. We'll help you out. If you can get credit somewhere else, we'll offer you a 6% loan. Now, you ask the question, is the Disaster Loan Fairness Act fair to the taxpayers? Well, let me ask you, do you think this is fair to the American taxpayers? In the last 2 years, We gave Pakistan $215 million for flood disaster relief. Did we insist that Pakistan, did we require them to have mitigation first before we use American tax dollars? Did we ask them, do they have insurance before we give American tax dollars? You know what interest they're paying? Not 6%, like we would have offered Mr. Teig. 0%. 0%. Is that fair to the American taxpayers? And you know what the payback is? There is no payback. They don't have to pay it back. So I would tell Mr. Teig if he wanted to move, maybe we want to say, maybe you should move to Pakistan, where we would have offered a 0% loan and you wouldn't have to pay the money back. We are trying to keep manufacturers and people in business, sir. We are not trying to make a profit or saying, well, maybe you're going to take advantage of it. We gave Japan $94 million for the recent tsunami and earthquake. We gave Haiti $838 million for disasters there. In fact, we gave $4.98 billion in humanitarian assistance. Now, we're all very proud of that because when disaster strikes, America is the first to help. And I'm proud to say that I'm an American and we do that. But, sir, I believe we should be helping Americans first. Now, this lone disaster bill isn't going to cost the taxpayers anything because I am offsetting it with aid, international aid, disaster aid, that would cover the cost. So should we not, my question is, should we not help Americans first?
I think flaws in our foreign aid system is an entirely different issue, and two wrongs do not make a right. So if our foreign aid system has questionable policies, that's a separate issue for a separate hearing and actually a separate committee. But I will add that we should be compassionate to help people recover from disasters. The question is the best way to do it. And the best way is to have preventative measures, help people mitigate against future disasters. And the problem with the SBA program is that it presents a moral hazard that people, it's an incentive not to have adequate insurance. It's an incentive not
But you're not answering my question. Should we not, if we could, take the money from international disaster relief before we help people who are affected by a flood in Pakistan, not help our own neighbors, our own friends, if this will not cost the American taxpayers, if a 1% loan, this isn't a small business loan, we're not encouraging people to open up a risky business. We're saying your business has been lost or your home has been lost to no fault of your own. And if we could not have a cost directly on the taxpayers by offsetting it with international disaster aid, why would we not do that? I'm just failing to miss. I understand what you're saying, and I'm all for mitigation. And many of the people who were affected here, sir, did not have flood insurance because they were told they weren't in a floodplain. And you know how long, Dr. Conrother, it takes before you see a check? I have constituents that have waited 6 months for an insurance check. 6 months. What does that business do in the meantime? This sounds good here, but when you're walking the streets and standing on the porches of these people, it doesn't work. And how do you justify that we help other people before we help Americans?
Nowhere in my testimony have I justified helping foreigners over Americans. So I think the question right here doesn't pertain to me. Maybe you need to ask Congress, your fellow congressmen, why aid is going to these foreign countries that you think are so questionable.
Well, then can I ask you this then? If I told you today that the 1% CBO has suggested that there will be no effect on direct spending, and that if we offset the discretionary cost by taking it out of international foreign disaster relief, if I told you that, would you then think that this bill maybe is a good idea, that we're helping Mr. Teig stay in business and other people stay in business before we help someone else?
Well, I think Mr. Teig stayed in business without SBA loans, and he would have stayed in business without the reforms.
If we can offset
I think offsetting would be an improvement in a flawed bill. It does not control for the moral hazard issue. It does not account for the fact that we are having too many disaster declarations that should be not nationalized. They should be handled best by local governments.
But for those that are.
For those that are.
For these folks right here.
There is a case where if there's a natural disaster that is so devastating that we need to, that it's beyond the capacity of state and local governments, there may be a case for SBA disaster loans. But if it's just a tornado, if it's a flood that people knew they were in a flood high-risk area for years and they continue to have their business located there, that presents a moral hazard issue. The policy should be, we shouldn't encourage people to be in dangerous areas. We should encourage people to be in safe areas.
Where should they move? You know, there could be an earthquake in California, so should everyone move from California? People in the Midwest, should, you know, there could be a tornado. Should they move out? Where will we move?
Well, in the case of hurricanes or I mean, earthquakes, you have to have good building codes to make sure buildings can withstand a severe earthquake. So obviously, you wouldn't have people leave California. But if you're sitting in an area where it's easy to move, where if you can move 1 mile up the road and be completely safe from a flood, that is a better solution to continuing a business in an area that's going to get flooded repeatedly.
And for the folks who are not in a floodplain but still lose everything to a flood, I guess my point is, you know, there are people who lose their homes, their possessions, their businesses, and choose to take the insurance, because we talked a lot about insurance today, and we seem to think that that's going to solve the problem. But if Mr. Teig takes his insurance check and decides, I'm done, does that help America? Is there not a return to the American taxpayer by helping American businesses stay in business because of a disaster that was no fault of their own and will not cost the American taxpayers any money, because we're going to take it from other countries that we're helping rather than...
Let me just interject, Mr. Why don't you take a breath, Dr. Mulhausen? Dr. Kunrather, why don't you jump in here?
I think you're raising really issues that are absolutely central to the challenges we face with natural disasters. When we focus, as you are, with your photos and with our example, Mr. Teig, on specific situations, we all want to help. We all want to do something to assist, and that's on political grounds. We understand that on equity and sympathy grounds. But Representative Barletta, I think that what we're saying, and I think what Dr. Mulhausen has been saying, and where we feel one should go is, can we take steps for Mr. Teig and for others to think about these events beforehand in a way that will be attractive to them so that they don't see that there's impositions on them in terms of actions they are taking? And what I mean by that is, if it turns out that you had higher limits, for example, on flood insurance, and the private sector may be able to even come in, we finished a study suggesting the private sector could supplement the federal government on that, and so you have full protection. If you are given incentives, and we'd have to talk with Mr. Teig and each individual business and home will be different on that, to take steps beforehand in order to reduce it, we would avoid a lot of the situations that you're talking about. And so I think we're all on the same page here.
Where we're differing, and I agree with you.
Okay.
I agree with you, exactly what you're saying, and okay. I'm with you. I get it. Where the disconnect is at the time when we do offer an SBA loan. Mm-hmm. For those, I mean, we're surely not suggesting do away with SBA disaster loans.
No.
So if we do all that you say, and I agree we should, that's a good idea, it's good policy. But for the times when we do offer those SBA loans, why would we not offer a 1% loan and give Americans a chance and an opportunity to get back up on their feet, to decide I'm going to stay in business and offset that cost? We make good points here, but if we're going to offset the cost, what I'm saying is let's not help that business in Pakistan before we help somebody in Pittston, Pennsylvania. I can't justify that, and there's no argument, I don't believe that as an American we can make, that we would rather help businesses somewhere in the world before we will help our own Americans here at home.
I'm not going to get into the foreign domestic on my response. I want to get in very directly to you. I understand the point, and I think that there are reasons to maybe ask where should our money go. But let me answer your point directly on the 1% loans. absolutely, at the end of the day, when there's a disaster, we have to ask ourselves who is in need. Now, there are a group of businesses who could afford to be able to take a loan out at a regular interest rate or at a higher interest rate, and affordability needs to be put on the table. And I would raise that issue for everyone. If someone can afford that and whatnot, there's a different story. If it happens to be a small business that may be in real need, one has to consider whether there should be special treatment. Now, the SBA program does exactly that today, as you know. It happens to have higher interest rates, excuse me, 4% and 8%, depending on whether there is affordability. The question that you're posing is, should you go down to 1%? And that's really a value judgment. It's a judgment that everyone has to make as to how much assistance we want to give and whether or not that money could have been spent better in other ways. I won't answer that question directly because I think at the end of the day, we as a society, and Congress plays that role, has to judge at what point do we want to provide special relief. And it certainly could be argued that if it turns out someone would not be able to stay in business unless they were going to be able to get a very, very small loan, a low-interest loan, then you may want to go in that direction. But I think as a general policy, and I think that's what we're talking about here in the way of the legislation, it sets a tone that really argues for post-disaster relief rather than protection beforehand. And that's the reason I think Dr. Mulhausen and I are making the comments we are. Let's take some steps beforehand rather than focus.
And I appreciate the arguments that you're making, but we can't ignore the fact that we give Pakistan flood disaster relief at zero interest. I know we're not here to solve, but we are. We are part of Congress, and we do look at the big picture. And the big picture is I'm sitting here seeing that we gave Pakistan $215 million with zero interest. How can we justify that and argue here that in your testimony saying, well, if an American business could afford to pay something else, why shouldn't an American business pay 6% interest if they could? But why should somebody in Pakistan, who I don't even know, pay 0% interest? That's the question that I'm asking my colleagues here. Do you think that is fair?
It sounds like a wonderful topic as well for another hearing. I'll give you time for a very brief answer because Mr. Barletta's time has expired. Go ahead, Dr. Cohen, if you want to wade into that at all.
No, I'm not going to weigh into that because I really want to second what Dr. Mulhausen said. I think there are two separate issues. I think one has to ask the question in Pakistan whether or not you're going to give a 0% interest rate if you're going to do it for other reasons, rather than sort of make the comparison between what we do in this country. I think that is an issue that should be put on the table, but not in the context of this particular piece of legislation.
Thank you. Mr. Barletta, thank you. On behalf of the entire subcommittee, I'd like to thank all of our witnesses for being here today. The testimony that you provided will be helpful as we continue to consider amendments to SBA's disaster assistance programs. As was mentioned in the opening, we want to make sure that our neighbors have the right tools to get back on their feet after a disaster. None of us question that. The question is how best to fund and supply those tools. The faster people get back on their feet, the better off we will all be as a nation. With that, without objection, I ask that the record be kept open for 5 legislative days. Without objection, so ordered. This hearing is now adjourned.